Highways were built to keep the world moving. They carried workers home after long shifts, families toward vacations, and truck drivers across endless states under open skies. At night, they became quieter but never truly silent. Tires hummed against asphalt, engines growled in the distance, and red tail lights stretched like glowing veins through the dark. No matter the hour, someone was always traveling somewhere. That was what made the first disappearance so easy to overlook. On a warm June night in 2014, a gray sedan was found parked on the shoulder of Interstate 81 in Virginia. Its hazard lights blinked steadily, casting short flashes onto the empty road. The driver's door was slightly open. The keys were still in the ignition. The fuel tank was half full, and the engine was warm enough to suggest the car had stopped only minutes before it was discovered. But the driver was nowhere to be seen. State troopers assumed it was a routine situation. Cars broke down every day. Drivers wandered off to find help, fell asleep in nearby ditches, or accepted rides from passing motorists. The vehicle was towed, a report was filed, and the case quietly joined hundreds of others that would likely never be revisited. 3 days later, another car was found. This time it was on Interstate 70, nearly 200 miles away. The details were unsettlingly similar. The car was parked neatly on the shoulder. The engine was warm. There were no skid marks, no broken glass, no signs of panic. The driver's phone sat on the passenger seat, screen dark, battery dead. The driver himself had vanished. Police departments in different states didn't communicate much about minor incidents like abandoned vehicles. Each case stayed within its own jurisdiction, filed by tired officers working long shifts. No one connected the dots because no one thought there were dots to connect. As June turned into July, the highways continued to swallow people. A traveling nurse heading to a night shift never arrived at her hospital in Tennessee. A delivery contractor vanished on a return trip through Ohio. A young salesman driving home after a conference in North Carolina was last seen entering a rest area just before midnight. Each time, a vehicle was found later. Each time, it looked as though the driver had stepped out willingly and expected to return. Families called police stations desperate for answers. They were told the same thing again and again. Adults disappear sometimes. They run away. They start new lives. They make bad decisions. The highways were full of people passing through, leaving few traces behind. But among those who lived on the road, something felt wrong. Truck drivers began talking quietly over coffee at rest stops. One driver mentioned seeing a stalled car under flickering lights, the driver standing beside it but not waving for help. Another spoke of a man in a reflective vest walking calmly along the shoulder at 2 in the morning, carrying no tools. Someone else described pulling into a rest area and noticing a dark utility van parked far from the building, engine running, lights off. None of these stories sounded dangerous on their own. Highways were strange places at night. People did odd things when they were tired. Still, the unease spread slowly, like a whisper carried from mile marker to mile marker. The first sign that something truly sinister was happening came when a woman's car was found on Interstate 95 with blood on the inside of the door handle. It was barely visible, just a faint smear, but it was enough to turn a routine report into a crime scene. The woman, a freelance photographer traveling alone, was never found. That discovery forced investigators to look back. When they did, a pattern began to emerge, though faint and fragile at first. The disappearances were spread across multiple states, but they all happened near major highways. They occurred late at night or in the early hours of the morning. The victims were always alone. And most unsettling of all, there were no witnesses who reported screams, struggles, or accidents. It was as if the victims had stepped off the road willingly, guided by someone they trusted. News outlets started to pick up the story. Headlines spoke of a growing number of missing drivers. Maps appeared on television screens, dotted with blinking lights that marked where people were last seen. The public began to feel uneasy about nighttime travel. Parents called their children to warn them not to stop for strangers. Truck stops installed brighter lights. Rest area attendants locked their doors earlier. Despite the fear, the highways remained busy. Life didn't pause just because something dangerous might be out there. Behind the scenes, investigators struggled. There were no clear suspects. No consistent vehicle descriptions. No usable camera footage. Highway cameras were designed to monitor traffic flow, not capture faces in the dark. Rest areas often had blind spots. Toll booths recorded thousands of vehicles an hour, making it nearly impossible to track one specific car without a license plate. The person responsible seemed to understand this perfectly. Every abandoned vehicle told the same story. Doors unlocked. Wallets still inside. No forced entry. It suggested that the victims hadn't been threatened at first. They hadn't been dragged screaming into the dark. They had left their cars calmly, expecting help, not harm. That detail haunted investigators. Who could convince a tired, cautious adult to step away from their vehicle on a dark highway? Who could approach without raising suspicion? The answer was simple and terrifying. Someone who looked like they belonged there. A uniform. A vest. A calm voice offering assistance. As summer deepened, so did the mystery. The number of missing drivers crossed into double digits. Some families received strange phone calls in the days after their loved ones vanished. The calls were short, silent. When traced, they led nowhere. The number always appeared as unknown. Then, in late August, a state trooper made a discovery that changed everything. While responding to a report of another abandoned vehicle, he noticed tire tracks leading off the shoulder and into a wooded area nearby. They were fresh, different from the car's own tracks. Larger. He followed them on foot for several minutes before losing them in the undergrowth. Nothing was found that night. No body. No evidence. But for the first time, it was clear that someone else had been there. Someone who didn't leave by accident. Someone who knew the roads better than most. As darkness fell and traffic continued to flow, the highways remained what they had always been on the surface. Long, empty stretches of pavement cutting through forests and fields. But beneath that familiar sight, something had changed. The roads were no longer just paths from one place to another. They had become a hunting ground. And the person using them was just getting started. By early autumn, the missing persons list had grown too long to ignore. What once looked like scattered incidents now felt connected by an invisible thread stretching across state lines. Families demanded answers, local police departments felt pressure from the media, and federal agencies began quietly paying attention. The highways, once symbols of freedom and movement, were slowly becoming symbols of fear. Detective Laura Mendez first encountered the case by accident. She worked major crimes in Maryland and was reviewing overnight reports when she noticed something familiar. Another abandoned car. Another lone driver missing. The details echoed reports she had read weeks earlier from other states. Same time of night. Same clean scene. Same silence. Laura printed the reports and spread them across her desk. One page turned into 10. 10 turned into dozens. When she pinned them to a board, the pattern became impossible to deny. The disappearances were not random. They followed the highways like a trail, hopping from one interstate to another, always near exits, rest stops, or long stretches without cameras. She contacted investigators in neighboring states. At first, they were skeptical. Each department had its own theory, its own workload. But as Laura shared timelines, maps, and similarities, resistance faded. The same questions haunted them all. How did someone vanish without leaving evidence? How did no one see anything? Phone records provided the first real lead. Technicians analyzed the last known activity of the victims' mobile phones. What they found raised alarms. Nearly every victim had either received or made a short phone call shortly before disappearing. None of the calls lasted more than 30 seconds. None showed a traceable number. They were all logged as unknown. At first, this detail seemed meaningless. Drop calls happened all the time on highways. But when the timestamps were aligned, a disturbing rhythm appeared. The calls always came minutes before the vehicles were abandoned. It was as if the calls were signals, not conversations. Laura gave the suspect a name for internal use. The highway ghost. Someone who appeared briefly, took people, and vanished without leaving a shadow. As the task force grew, so did the pressure. Media coverage intensified. News vans parked near rest areas. Reporters interviewed truck drivers and gas station attendants. Fear crept into everyday decisions. People debated whether to stop for gas at night. Some canceled road trips entirely. Despite the attention, the killer adjusted easily. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He moved with patience, as if he had all the time in the world. Security footage became the next focus. Investigators reviewed thousands of hours of video from toll booths, gas stations, and rest stops. It was exhausting work. Faces blurred together. Vehicles passed by too quickly. Most footage revealed nothing useful. Then, finally, something appeared. In grainy footage from a toll plaza in Pennsylvania, a dark utility van passed through shortly after one of the disappearances. The camera caught only a partial image, but the shape was distinct. Boxy. Unmarked. No visible company logo. The license plate was either missing or altered beyond recognition. Days later, the same type of van appeared again in footage from a different state. Same color. Same body style. Always late at night. Always near the times victims vanished. The highway ghost was real. Investigators tried tracking the van's movement, but it slipped through their fingers. It avoided toll roads whenever possible. It exited highways just before major camera zones. Whoever was driving it knew the system well. Too well. That knowledge troubled Laura deeply. This wasn't a criminal acting on impulse. This was someone with experience. Someone familiar with traffic patterns, law enforcement routines, and blind spots along the road. Victim profiles offered little comfort. There was no single type. Men and women. Different ages. Different professions. The only consistent detail was that they were alone and traveling at night. The killer wasn't choosing people. He was choosing situations. Trust was the weapon. The first body was found in late October. A hiker stumbled across shallow disturbed soil in a wooded area not far from Route 40. Beneath it was a man reported missing weeks earlier. There were no obvious wounds. No signs of a struggle. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was poisoning. That detail sent a chill through the task force. Poison meant control. It meant the victim had been subdued quietly. Likely inside the van. Likely without force. The victim had probably believed they were safe right up until the moment they weren't. The discovery sparked panic. The highway ghost was no longer just a kidnapper. He was a serial killer. Public warnings were issued. Drivers were advised not to accept help from strangers. Roadside assistance companies reminded customers to verify identification. Police increased patrols along major highways, but it made little difference. The killer didn't need to strike often. He waited. He watched. He chose carefully. Then came the phone call that changed everything. A man in Ohio reported that he had almost been taken. His car had stalled near a rest area just after midnight. While he was checking his engine, a van pulled up behind him. The driver wore a reflective vest and spoke calmly, offering help. Something about the man's eyes made the victim uneasy. When he refused the ride, the van stayed parked for several minutes before driving away slowly. The man hadn't thought much of it at first, but after seeing news reports, he called police. His description matched what little investigators had. The van, the vest, the calm voice. Laura felt both relief and dread. Relief because they finally had an encounter. Dread because it confirmed their worst fear. The killer was posing as help. More reports followed. None resulted in attacks, but the sightings painted a clearer picture. The highway ghost blended into the environment perfectly. On a dark road, a reflective vest meant authority. It meant safety. It meant trust. Behind closed doors, investigators debated how many victims there truly were. Some disappearances likely went unreported. Some vehicles were never found. Some families may never know what happened. As winter approached, the killings slowed. Some hoped it meant the highway ghost had stopped. Others believed he was simply waiting. Laura didn't sleep much anymore. She replayed footage in her mind, imagined the van idling under dim lights, the calm voice offering reassurance. She wondered how many times she herself had driven past something dangerous without knowing it. One night, while reviewing call logs again, she noticed something new. The unknown calls weren't random. They originated from areas with limited cell coverage, places where tracing was difficult, places known to traffic engineers and surveillance specialists. The realization hit her hard. This wasn't just someone familiar with highways. This was someone trained to understand them. The highway ghost wasn't guessing. He was planning every move. And somewhere out there, under the endless stretch of asphalt and night sky, he was already choosing his next stop. The case had reached a breaking point by the time Ethan Cole walked into the police station. Weeks of dead ends, exhausted investigators, and terrified families had created an atmosphere thick with pressure. When Ethan asked to speak to someone about an attempted abduction on Highway 66, officers listened carefully. When he said he had escaped from a man driving a dark utility van, they closed the door and called Detective Laura Mendez immediately. Ethan was 22 years old, thin, pale, and visibly shaken. He had dark circles under his eyes, the kind that came from nights without sleep. His hands trembled as he held a paper cup of water. Laura sat across from him, her voice calm, encouraging him to take his time. She knew moments like this were rare. Survivors didn't come forward often, especially not in cases like this. Ethan explained that he had been driving back to campus after visiting his family. It was late, just after midnight, and the highway was mostly empty. About 30 miles outside the city, his car began to lose power. Warning lights flickered on the dashboard, and the engine died shortly after. He managed to steer onto the shoulder and turn on his hazard lights. At first, he tried calling roadside assistance, but there was no signal. The highway stretched out before him, quiet and dark, broken only by passing trucks every few minutes. He waited inside his car, doors locked, telling himself that someone would stop eventually. Less than 10 minutes later, headlights appeared behind him. A dark utility van pulled up smoothly, stopping a few feet away. The driver stepped out wearing a reflective safety vest. He looked official, like someone who belonged there. Middle-aged, clean-shaven, average build. He moved slowly, confidently, as if nothing about the situation surprised him. The man knocked gently on Ethan's window and smiled. He introduced himself as roadside assistance. His voice was calm and friendly. He said he had seen the stalled car while patrolling the highway. He asked Ethan to step out so he could take a look under the hood. Ethan hesitated. Something felt off, but he couldn't explain why. The man didn't rush him. He didn't pressure him. He simply waited, hands visible, posture relaxed. That patience made Ethan trust him more than urgency would have. Ethan stepped out of the car. The man glanced briefly at the engine, then said the issue was likely electrical and couldn't be fixed on the roadside. He offered Ethan a ride to the nearest rest area, where they could call for proper help. It sounded reasonable, sensible, even. Ethan agreed. Inside the van, the air smelled sharp and chemical, like cleaning fluid. The interior was unusually clean, almost empty. There were no tools, no equipment, nothing that confirmed the man's story. As the van pulled back onto the highway, Ethan reached for his phone, but the man gently told him there was no signal anyway. That was when Ethan noticed the door handle. There was no handle on the inside. A cold wave of fear washed over him. He tried not to panic. He asked casually how long the man had worked roadside assistance. The man answered smoothly, giving vague responses that sounded practiced. As the minutes passed, Ethan's heart pounded harder. The van didn't slow near the rest area. It didn't signal to exit. Instead, it continued down the highway, moving farther away from the lights. Ethan reached for the door again, harder this time. It didn't budge. The man's voice changed slightly. Still calm, but firmer now. He told Ethan to relax. Everything would be fine. That was the moment Ethan knew he was in danger. He lunged forward, grabbing the steering wheel. The van swerved violently. The man shouted for the first time, struggling to regain control. Tires screeched as the vehicle slammed into a concrete barrier. Airbags exploded. The van spun and came to rest sideways across the shoulder. Dazed but alive, Ethan kicked open the passenger side window and crawled out. His legs burned as he ran, not daring to look back. He reached the road and flagged down the first truck he saw. By the time police arrived, the van was gone. As Ethan finished his story, the room was silent. Laura asked him to describe the man in detail. Ethan closed his eyes and concentrated. He described the shape of his face, the color of his hair, the way his voice sounded almost comforting, like a teacher or a counselor. He mentioned something else that stood out. The man had spoken as if he knew exactly how the situation would unfold, as if he had done it many times before. A sketch artist worked with Ethan for hours. When the final image was complete, Laura felt a chill run down her spine. The face looked ordinary. Too ordinary. The kind of man you wouldn't remember twice if you passed him in a grocery store. That made him dangerous. The sketch was circulated among law enforcement agencies and quietly shown to families of victims. Then it was released to the public. Tips poured in. Some were useless, others disturbing. Several people claimed to recognize the man as someone who had helped them on the highway in the past. Then came the tip that stopped Laura cold. A fellow officer mentioned that the sketch resembled a man who had been attending task force meetings. A volunteer. Someone who had been offering support to families of the missing. His name was Thomas Reeve. Thomas was a former traffic safety officer who had retired early due to budget cuts. He now spent his time volunteering with highway safety programs and missing person searches. He handed out pamphlets at rest stops. He spoke softly to grieving families. He knew the system, the cameras, the patrol schedules. Laura replayed every interaction she'd had with him. He had always been helpful, always calm, always present, too present. When investigators looked closer, the pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. Thomas owned a dark utility van. He wore reflective vests regularly. His phone records showed gaps during the times of several disappearances. His knowledge of highway surveillance was extensive. Surveillance teams were assigned immediately. They followed Thomas discreetly for days. What they saw chilled them. He drove long stretches at night, stopping near rest areas without entering them. He parked under broken lights. He watched. When police searched his storage unit, the evidence was undeniable. Victims' belongings carefully cleaned and labeled. Phones powered off. Jewelry wrapped in cloth. License plates stacked against the wall. Thomas was arrested quietly, without incident. During interrogation, he didn't deny it. He spoke calmly, almost kindly, explaining that highways were places where people let their guard down, where everyone was passing through, and no one truly belonged. He said he helped people find peace. But when asked how he avoided detection for so long, Thomas smiled. He said he wasn't alone. He said someone had taught him where to stop, when cameras were blind, and how police thought. Someone who knew the system even better than he did. Before investigators could press him further, Thomas leaned back in his chair and said something that haunted Laura long after. "The road doesn't end," he said. "It just changes direction." For the first time since the case began, Laura felt true fear. Because even with Thomas in custody, the highways outside were still moving, and whatever he had started might not be finished. Thomas Reeves' arrest sent shockwaves through the task force and the public alike. News stations interrupted regular programming to report that the man who had comforted families and volunteered in searches was now accused of being the highway ghost. His calm face appeared on screens everywhere, frozen in still images taken years earlier at safety events and community meetings. For many, it was impossible to believe. For others, it was a horrifying confirmation that evil could wear the mask of kindness. In the days following his arrest, highways felt quieter, as if the roads themselves were holding their breath. Families of the missing clung to cautious hope. Maybe now they would get answers. Maybe now the nightmare would end. Inside the interrogation room, Thomas showed no fear. He sat straight-backed, hands folded, eyes steady. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. When detectives asked about the victims, he referred to them not as people but as travelers. He said highways erased identity. Everyone was just passing through, anonymous and vulnerable. He explained how he chose his moments. Late nights, dim lights, broken cameras. He studied patrol schedules the way others studied weather reports. He knew when help was scarce and exhaustion was high. He said he never forced anyone. He didn't have to. People wanted help. They trusted the vest, the van, the voice. Listening to him made even seasoned detectives uneasy. There was no anger in his tone. No guilt. Only certainty. When asked about the poison found in the victim system, Thomas shrugged. He said it was humane. Quiet. He said struggle ruined things. Then came the question that changed everything. Laura asked him how he had managed to stay invisible for so long. How he crossed state lines without triggering alarms. How he knew exactly where cameras failed and when police weren't watching. Thomas leaned back and smiled. He said he had learned from someone better. The room went silent. At first, investigators assumed it was manipulation, a way to spread fear or bargain for attention. But when pressed, Thomas provided details only someone with inside knowledge could know. He spoke of outdated surveillance systems, still quietly in use. Of backup cameras never checked. Of blind zones intentionally left unmapped to save money. Details that were not public. Laura felt a cold weight settle in her chest. If Thomas was telling the truth, then the highway ghost wasn't just a lone predator. He was part of something larger. A chain. Before investigators could act on this revelation, events took a sudden and devastating turn. 3 days after his arrest, Thomas Reeve was found dead in his cell. The official report said suicide. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. A single sheet torn and twisted into a noose. The timing was cruel. Interrogations had barely begun. Leads had not yet been followed. Public reaction was immediate and explosive. Some believed Thomas had taken the coward's way out. Others suspected something darker. Online forums filled with theories. Had someone silenced him? Had he been protecting someone else? Inside the task force, doubt replaced relief. Laura couldn't accept the explanation so easily. Thomas had been calm, calculating, proud of his control. Ending his life didn't fit the image he had presented. And yet, without evidence, questions remained only questions. The case was officially closed weeks later. Thomas Reeve was declared the sole perpetrator. Families were given partial answers. Some remains were identified. Some never found. Memorials were held. The media moved on. But Laura didn't. She kept thinking about Thomas's final words. About the knowledge he claimed to have been given. About the possibility that someone else had shaped him, guided him, and then disappeared. Months passed. Winter gave way to spring. The highways returned to their usual rhythm. Fear faded into memory. People traveled at night again. Then, one evening, Laura received a call that made her blood run cold. Another abandoned car had been found. It was on a different highway this time, hundreds of miles from the earlier crime scenes. But the details were painfully familiar. Engine warm. Doors unlocked. No sign of struggle. The driver missing. Laura rushed to the scene. As she stood on the shoulder, watching traffic blur past, she felt the same unease she had felt at the beginning of the case. The sense that the road was hiding something in plain sight. Phone records confirmed it. The missing driver had received a call minutes before disappearing. The number showed as unknown. The highway ghost was back. Or was. As reports trickled in, it became clear that the methods hadn't changed. The patience. The timing. The quiet efficiency. Whoever was responsible now had learned well. Too well. Investigators reopened the case under a new name, but resources were limited. No one wanted to admit that the nightmare hadn't ended. Admitting it meant admitting failure. Laura worked in silence, re-examining old files. She revisited Thomas's interrogation transcripts, reading between the lines. She noticed how often he spoke about learning, about being shown, about being corrected. It sounded less like a partnership and more like mentorship. She focused on one detail that had been overlooked before. Thomas had mentioned surveillance knowledge that predated his career. Knowledge from years earlier, before he ever worked traffic safety. That meant the source had to be someone with long-term access to highway systems. Someone who had retired. Someone forgotten. Laura dug into old employment records, cross-referencing names of former highway surveillance analysts and communications specialists. The list was short. Many had moved away. Some had died. One name stood out. A man who had worked behind the scenes for decades. Rarely seen. Never photographed. Responsible for monitoring traffic data and camera feeds. He had trained younger staff, including Thomas Reeve, before retiring quietly. After retirement, he vanished from public view. Laura felt the pieces align in her mind. The mentor. The system expert. The man who knew not only where the cameras were, but how people thought they worked. This person had never needed to drive the van. He never needed to approach victims. He had created the perfect student and watched from the shadows. Thomas had been the trap. When Laura brought her theory to superiors, the reaction was cautious. There was no direct evidence. No recent sightings. No reason to believe the mentor had continued the killings himself. But Laura knew better. Because the new disappearances were too precise. Too careful. The killer wasn't experimenting. He was continuing. The highways were still being used as they always had been. Long, open, and anonymous. A place where people trusted that help would come if they needed it. Someone out there was counting on that trust. And this time, he wasn't making the mistakes Thomas had made. He was watching, waiting, and learning from everything that had already gone wrong. The first mistake was small, almost invisible, but to Laura Mendez it stood out like a flare in the dark. After months of silence, the renewed disappearances had followed the same careful rhythm as before. Same highways, same late hours, same calm vanishing acts. Whoever was responsible had learned from Thomas Reeve's downfall. There were fewer risks, fewer appearances, and no emotional traces left behind. But one thing had changed. The phone calls. Laura had been reviewing call data late one night, her office lit only by the glow of her computer screen. The unknown calls were still there, just as before. Short, untraceable at first glance. But one of them behaved differently. It connected for 2 seconds longer than the others. Not enough to notice casually, but enough to leave a faint technical echo. It was the kind of anomaly only someone obsessed would catch. Laura requested a deeper analysis. The technicians warned her not to expect much. Whoever was making the calls knew how to hide. But when the results came back, her breath caught. The signal hadn't come from a civilian device. It carried markers used only in older government-issued communication equipment. The highway ghost had made a mistake. Laura felt the weight of months of frustration shift into sharp focus. This wasn't just a killer using knowledge of the system. This was someone who had been part of it. Someone who still had access to tools long forgotten, devices no one thought to monitor anymore. The search narrowed quickly. Only a handful of retired employees had ever been issued that kind of equipment. Fewer still had the technical knowledge to modify it. As Laura cross-checked records, one name rose again to the surface, just as it had before. A former highway communications analyst who had worked quietly behind the scenes for nearly 30 years. He had trained Thomas Reeve once. He had retired without ceremony. And after retirement, he had almost completely disappeared. His name was never in the news. It never appeared in interviews. That was how he liked it. Laura traveled with a small team to a remote property just beyond a rural highway interchange. The house sat far back from the road, nearly hidden by trees. It was the kind of place you would never notice unless you were looking for it. A perfect vantage point. A perfect hiding place. As they approached, Laura noticed something chilling. From the porch, the highway was visible through the trees. Cars passed endlessly, headlights flashing like distant signals. The man who lived here didn't need to leave to feel connected to the road. The road came to him. Inside the house, evidence was everywhere. Maps covered the walls, marked with dates and mile numbers. Old surveillance equipment hummed quietly in a back room, connected to modern screens through improvised wiring. Logs detailed traffic patterns, patrol gaps, and camera blind spots, updated meticulously over time. This wasn't obsession. It was maintenance. The man was found sitting calmly in a chair, watching a live feed of traffic. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't deny what he had done. He looked at Laura with tired eyes and said something that chilled her more than any confession. "I never touched them," he said softly. "I just showed others where to stand." He explained everything with unsettling clarity. Highways, he said, were systems built on trust and routine. Drivers trusted that help would arrive. Police trusted that cameras worked. Everyone trusted that the road was neutral. He had spent decades learning where that trust failed. Thomas Reeve had been his first student, a man eager to belong to something meaningful. The mentor taught him where to stop, how to watch, when to move. He corrected his mistakes from afar. And when Thomas drew too much attention, he let him fall. The new disappearances, he admitted, were his doing. Not directly. He never approached victims. He never drove the van. He had refined the method, reduced the risk. The phone calls were enough now. A voice, a suggestion, a direction to step away from the car. People listened, because when you're alone on a dark highway, you want to believe the voice offering guidance knows what it's doing. As the man was led away, Laura felt no triumph, only exhaustion. The case was over, but the damage was permanent. Lives had been taken not by rage or chaos, but by careful understanding of human behavior. In the months that followed, highways were upgraded, cameras replaced, old systems dismantled, policies rewritten. The story faded from headlines, replaced by new fears, new tragedies. But Laura never forgot. Sometimes, late at night, she still drove those roads. She watched the traffic flow and thought about how close danger could hide to something so ordinary. She thought about how many people had passed through that man's view without ever knowing it. The highways returned to what they had always been. Long busy. Alive. Yet for those who knew the story, the road would never feel entirely empty again. Because somewhere between exits, between destinations, the memory remained. And every time a car slowed on the shoulder, every time hazard lights blinked in the dark, the question lingered quietly in the back of the mind.